Today, I'm going to tell you the surprising story of how the Ryohei V60 became one of the most popular brewers in the whole world, in homes, in cafes. I'm going to argue that one particular company, more than any other, is responsible for making it the most iconic brewer of the specialty coffee movement. Starbucks. Now, that's probably a little bit of a surprise. Starbucks never really used the V60 or promoted it. How could they have made it the most iconic brewer? It's a good question. To answer it, I need to introduce you to another coffee brewer. This one is called the Clover 1S. It's made by the Coffee Equipment Company. You've probably never heard of it, but it's also probably why you own a V60. Now, to make sense of all of this, I'm going to take you back in time, 20 years ago. Now, these were the early days of specialty coffee. The coffee community was small and also spread out all around the world. This meant that trade shows and events were incredibly important, as these were rare opportunities for us to get together and obsess over coffee in the same room. And it was at one of these events that Clover made their public debut.
I believe it was 2005 at Coffee Fest, a big coffee conference in Seattle. And Clover, they set up a warehouse across the street from the convention center, but it wasn't a warehouse. I believe it was a dirt floor. They had like some string lights, some polytarp, and these machines set up in the middle of this warehouse. It was a bit of the buzz around the conference that you've got to go across the street and check out this new machine. And that's where I first saw the Clover and I first met Zander Nosler.
I'm a mechanical engineer and product designer by training. In my consulting career, we did a Starbucks product. We worked on an office coffee machine for Starbucks. The program manager at Starbucks showed us this printed out spreadsheet of every machine that they wished existed that didn't exist. And it was this huge spreadsheet. There were 60 machines that were just for the hospitality sector, not even for personal home use type stuff. And we were having the consulting company I was at was having a board meeting, and I got asked to come in and present on how the Starbucks relationship was going, because that was a big client for them, really exciting. And I showed the board this spreadsheet of all these machines they wished existed. And one of our board members, he looked at that thing and he's like, wow, if I was a younger man, there's a business there. And I thought to myself, I'm a younger man. I just felt like I love brewed coffee, and I just was amazed by how underserved the coffee industry was by technology.
The time between 2000 and say 2004, that was espresso explosion. That was all the innovation in espresso, from equipment, from grinders to coffee, that had kind of been done very well. We were finally, I think, as an industry, quite happy. And brewed coffee was on the sideline.
So you've got to remember, in the early 2000s, the specialty coffee movement is really driven by coffee roasters. They're going out and they're sourcing these really small lots of very high quality coffee, way more traceable suddenly. They're building these direct relationships with producers. And the coffees are amazing, but they are perhaps better suited to filter coffee than to espresso. It's easy to forget, but back then filter coffee was incredibly cheap. It's like $1.50 for a cup of coffee from an urn with free refills. People didn't value filter coffee all that much.
When I joined Intelligentsia, the way they made filter coffee was on a Grindmaster urn. They're big machines, they're hot machines. And that was at a time when it was 20 ounces of drip coffee all day long, and the urn could do an awful lot of it.
We were in a tricky situation that we couldn't buy more expensive coffees. And if we did, how were we going to increase then the price of our batch brewed coffees? That was not possible for the people that expected the coffee to stay at the same price. But we, as coffee professionals, coffee geeks, really wanted to taste these coffees. As a business owner, I wanted to sell them, but we had no way of making these coffees until the Clover arrived.
In 2005, two Stanford grads, Zander Nosler and Ryohei, started putting together their business plan to create a new company, hoping to bring some technology to drip coffee.
I knew Zander and Jorah had been tinkering with his business plan for, 6 months, but I had never seen it. I didn't know the details. And then Zander cagily kind of said, hey, we'd love to get your feedback on the business plan. And it just says the Coffee Equipment Company on the front. And he's like, but before you look at the business plan, I need to tell you one thing about the business plan so you're prepared.
you're in it. And so that was how I became part of the coffee equipment company.
The coffee equipment company's first project was a kind of bean-to-cup filter coffee machine targeted at offices and called the Magnolia. But during development, one of the engineers on the team started to mess around with the brewing chamber from the machine and created a new prototype that they called the Chalupa.
It was just like this total like science experiment next to this thing that looked really polished and ready to go. And so we started taking that thing on the road, showing it to people, and we'd show them how the office coffee machine was going to work, but then also make a cup of coffee with the science experiment. Yeah, invariably people loved watching the science experiment, and the cup of coffee was way better too. The feedback was pretty unanimous. Like people were like, the coffee's amazing, but why are you making an office coffee machine? That's the dumbest thing ever. I can't make coffee this good in my own shop. Why would I try to put it in an office? Can you make me something that would go in the shop?
The office machine was complicated. It had more systems. It had grinders, it had dosing, it had cleaning. And I think one of the huge unlocks was the CEO of Pete's at the time came in and he's like, why don't you let the barista provide some of the theater and do some of the tasks? Like it doesn't need to be push button like this office machine you're prototyping. And that all of a sudden took all these systems that were complicated and expensive and unreliable and let a person do them like grinding and dosing and the squeegee scrape that the machine's known for.
So they went back to the lab, re-engineered a new machine from the ashes of the Magnolia. What they ended up with, they called the Clover. So at this point, I should probably explain how this brewer works. It is kind of part of the story too. As a brewer, it's a mixture of immersion and percolation. So it's kind of like an AeroPress, except 500 times more expensive. Now, as a user, at the front end of the control panel, you could choose your desired brew volume, as well as your desired steep time. You could also program the temperature in as well, and then you'd hit go, and the whole thing would start. Now we add some coffee. And the machine adds your desired amount of water, the right temperature. And then there's the opportunity for the first bit of theatre. We have to mix our ground coffee and our water. People were really into their stirring techniques. Which whisk you used? Should it be a bamboo paddle? Should it be something else? What kind of figure of 8 were you drawing on the top of it? It got pretty intense. Now it's going to steep for as long as we want it to steep. And then the kind of separation process will begin. The piston will lift everything up, and then underneath the screen it will pull down, creating a partial vacuum. That will pull the coffee liquid through that fine mesh filter on the top, separating the liquid from the grounds. The liquid will be dispensed, and the ground coffee brought up to the very top, presented to us oh so beautifully. Ta-da! Ready, of course, for you to get your squeegee and squeegee the whole thing clean. How did you feel about the squeegee?
The squeegee was fine, except sometimes you get those like wet pucks that would come up, and that was like dripping everywhere.
I think our technique was just do it very quickly and not draw too much attention to it. And then we actually had to use a cloth to wipe the screen, to wipe the filter, and then do a rinse.
I remain obsessed with the squeegee because this was $11,000 for this machine. And they're like, now that you've finished brewing.
I mean, but it looked cool and it dumped into this like plastic thing.
That was sort of the messy part of using the machine, is that now you have all this coffee up here. What are you going to do with it?
Well, whose idea was the squeegee?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think we ever even asked, how should we get rid of the grounds after the first couple tries of like, it's going to be a wiper. And it was a wiper from like the minute we started thinking about automated brew groups till the Clover came along. So
I remember our first prototypes of the automatic machines. There was always the wiper, and they'd come off and scrape most of the coffee into a bucket. But then the wiper would be dirty, so then you put a wiper. They would wipe the wiper, and
there were jokes about
the wiper.
When I saw the demo and tasted the coffee, Zander asked me, "Would you buy one of these machines?" And I said, "I would open a store with only these machines."
I spent a summer working in Vancouver, because at that time Vancouver was like the place. And I got a job at Wicked Cafe, and that was also not very far at all from Elysian Cafe, where Robert and Alastair ran their business. They had a Clover. That's probably the first time I encountered it.
We bought the first Clover. We were the first cafe in the world to install one of these in a coffee shop.
And I remember coming to Vancouver and just making a beeline for Elysian. They were a multi-roaster cafe, it felt like, before everyone else was a multi-roaster cafe. And the thing I wanted to experience was their menu of filter coffees.
We had then, for the first time, the ability to purchase different coffees from different roasters and sell them at different prices.
So the advantages of the Clover were clear. You can brew and sell a range of coffees, create different experiences, but the machine cost around $9,000 per unit. Could it justify that hefty price tag? Now, one aspect of the industry being smaller back then is that buzz and kind of hype built faster, and the buzz around Clover just exploded.
We would get mobbed at the trade shows. It was definitely like amazing. Like it would be difficult to get back into our booth if you left it.
There was a certain attraction to visit the coffee shops that had Clovers because you had choices and you had different coffees.
In Silver Lake in Los Angeles, when Intelligentsia opened there, I think they opened with a Clover and they had an urn for the bar. I don't think they ever turned it on.
You know, when you watch someone do a pour over and you're in a hurry, you like dying a little inside because it looks so slow. But for some reason, with the Clovers, it was like the sounds and the up and down, the movement, and we're turning knobs. You felt like a DJ almost behind the machine.
It was very hip to have a Clover.
But despite all the press, all the hype, all the interest, behind the scenes, the company was starting to struggle.
You could get 500 people at a trade show very, very excited about it, but then like in terms of getting the commitments to cut those checks, like that was where the disconnect was. It was really hard.
I think they had probably more interest than they had business. I remember Zander and his partners being extremely stressed out because they had continued to fund it and they weren't getting into production and getting the traction that they needed.
And I just remember vividly, like we had to sell 25 machines a month to break even. And we would get to 18 and then 19 and 20 because it was just super hard fought to get each one of those units sold.
The engineering of it was entirely custom. It had a lot of parts. You're dealing with electricity, you're dealing with water delivery, you're dealing with pistons. I have no idea what it cost to make one of those machines, but I don't imagine they were making much money, if not losing lots and lots of money.
We had a service tech, I think 2 service techs. We made them ourselves. So we had, factory space, and we had 1 or 2 people that would make them. And we were an engineering-driven team, and we were a company, and we believed we were going to make a lot more kinds of machines. So we had like 3 or 4 people as engineers on staff, which was expensive.
Clover are a company on the edge. They may have a solution to a problem, but their target market just doesn't have a ton of cash when they start their businesses. The economy's in a difficult place, and specialty coffee as a whole, it's still a fringe thing. They're running out of money. They're running out of options.
When they sold to that famous coffee company, it was like pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
We were trying to make it work, but it was just an uphill battle. And when Starbucks came along, it seemed like an opportunity to help the company keep doing what it was doing. This long drawn-out negotiation ensued, but oh my God, like we closed, and then 2 days later, the housing market crashed, and the recession hit, and we would have 100% been out of business by like March 15th. No question.
I should give you some background here, because Starbucks were in a tricky spot, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to feel sorry for them. They'd just come through a big kind of controversy around exploitative farming practices from their suppliers in Ethiopia.
And we're out here today to tell Starbucks to honor their commitment to Ethiopian coffee farmers.
And then they had gotten perhaps overly ambitious with their store rollout. They nearly doubled the number of stores, and there were so many Starbucks that they had started to cannibalize their own businesses. And then you've got this new, young, upstart side of the coffee industry starting to kind of boom and explode as well.
I think that they were getting pressed from both ends pretty badly. They were getting pressed from the specialty world. The specialty world was making way better coffee than they were. And they were getting pressed by Dunkin' and McDonald's, who were making way cheaper coffee than they were. They were in that middle place that was, I think, really uncomfortable.
All of this, a difficult economy, meant that in 2007, Starbucks' shares slumped by 42%. One of the worst performing companies listed on the NASDAQ that year. Now, you know Howard Schultz, the man famous for taking that small Seattle-based coffee chain and turning it into the global behemoth that Starbucks was. Well, he'd stepped down as CEO a few years earlier, But he was still involved, still a major shareholder, and as the financial situation inside Starbucks worsened, he returned. In January 2008, Howard Schultz was once again CEO of Starbucks. And 2 months later would be his first shareholders meeting since his return. It would be the chance to unveil his plan to revitalize the whole company. Looking back at the announcements made in the shareholders meeting, you can see that this was a pivotal moment. Howard Schultz announced their new Mastrena espresso machine. He announced the new Starbucks reward card. And for his one more thing, he brought up Zander on stage to brew coffee and to announce that Starbucks had acquired the coffee equipment company and the Clover with it.
And I remember getting back to my seat after the little shtick we did up there, and my phone is like beeping, and it's Matt Lounsbury from Stumptown. His text, "What the f***, Zander?" This is only... Yeah. I was like, oh, what are you going to do, man?
Famously, Dwayne Sorensen, the founder of Stumptown Coffee, on the day of the Starbucks announcement, pulled every single Clover out of all of their shops. He was immediately done with them.
On principle, many companies didn't want to have anything to do or no comparison to Starbucks. And the fact that Starbucks were going to have these in their stores, that was an immediate, like, get it out of here.
In 2008, Specialty most definitely saw Starbucks as the enemy. Yes, they had helped raise the minimum price people were willing to pay for a cup of coffee, but they were still seen as being ultimately oppositional to the goals of specialty coffee. And so when Starbucks bought this thing that people were starting to build a kind of new business model around, well, that felt deeply personal.
There were folks on our team who had a real hard time with it, to the point where some were like, I would rather have seen the company die than be bought. It wasn't the outcome we'd imagined. We'd imagined making money. We imagined like returning investment to our, to our supporters. But it was a lot better than watching the recession hit and then going out of business and leaving a smoking career in the ground. So, yeah.
We should see if James wants to hear the story about the signing of the
Oh my
papers.
God, yeah. So maybe even, we were so naive and young and dumb, and so we've come to an agreement on the deal, and it took forever to do the paperwork, and the lawyers had to go back and forth. But we finally get to where they're signing, and Howard and Michelle Goss and Troy Alstead, come over, and you remember the story better.
Yeah, so they're like there to sign the papers, and Troy and Zander are kind of sitting down, and they're going to take care of like the administration of this contract. And we're in this little tiny room with Howard and his CMO Michelle Goss, and I'm kind of just standing there with nothing to do, and there's a Clover in the room, so I'm like, hey, does anybody want some coffee? And all of them like perk up, and Howard gets this big smile on his face. He's like, great, he finally gets to drink a coffee off this machine he just bought. And so we're like, yeah, we'd all love a coffee. And I was like, oh, Howard, come over here. So we take like 5 steps across this tiny room. And we had the most amazing coffee in that room. Like between like people like learning how to service the machine and customers and also, we had this huge pile, like a mound. It wasn't even like organized. It was like a huge pile on the counter of specialty coffee that was amazing. Yeah. And so I walk Howard over there and I'm like, well, what do you want to try? Like, there's this Ethiopia, and he's like, no, and he's still got a smile, and how about this Sumatra? And we're kind of picking through and getting closer and closer to, like, the middle, and he's, like, not quite finding what he's looking for, and I think he's thinking to himself, like, surely some advanced man has, like, planted a bag of Starbucks at the bottom of this pile for me, so I'm not embarrassed.
Or they're not so stupid as to not have a single bag of Starbucks coffee.
Or that. Yeah, but we knew they were coming that day. We knew Howard was going to be there. And sure enough, we get to the bottom of this pile, and there's no Starbucks coffee. And Howard's like, do you have any Starbucks? And I was like, no, but like this one over here is really good. And he's like, I only drink Starbucks coffee. And got this sour look on his face. And then I was like, okay, Michelle and Troy, like, how about you guys? They're like, we're not thirsty anymore.
But why had Starbucks bought this company? Was it a smart strategic play? Were they acquiring a technology and a team? Or was it just to spite the specialty coffee industry?
The cynical angle of believing that Starbucks was buying it just to take off the market, I think that's definitely a possibility, but to me, honestly, it felt very aspirational.
I think they believe the business model of making unique signature coffees on the machine.
The clover sort of threatened and changed the paradigm of what our expectation at a retail level for brewed coffee could be. They were just about to get the next level of sort of almost exponential buy-in from the industry itself and consumers.
And you're right. I think it's to take away this toy that is very irritating, that's taking off in the specialty coffee industry, of the likes of Intelligentsia and other companies that are making a wave with this.
I can be pretty cynical about Starbucks. I'm not really like some sort of diehard loyalist. But like, I have a hard time buying into the whole like they just bought it to take it away.
In Howard's own words, Clover's quality and beauty were not only thrilling, but posed a very real competitive threat, even at its premium price per cup. So much of a threat that I believe Starbucks needed to own it. Now.
My memory of when Starbucks bought them was remarking at the idea of Howard Schultz going into Grumpy, the Caroline shop in Chelsea, right?
Howard Schultz tells the story about falling in love with the Clover. He goes to New York City. He goes to Cafe Grumpy. He buys a cup of coffee there for $8. And he thinks it's brilliant. It's an amazing, delicious cup of coffee. And at that point, he's in love with the Clover. He's got to have it. This story always bothered me. Were you surprised to have been mentioned in Howard's story?
Yeah, I was surprised, but I don't know, I wasn't really thinking about it. To me, it's like, who cares? It's Howard Schultz. I don't know. It's Starbucks. I didn't care. Now I'd be like, that's quite like interesting and how cool. But I wasn't there that day. The baristas told me it happened. Some of them didn't know who it was. Some did. Someone recognized him, and that was all.
I thought the first time he saw the Clover was at the... Do you want another anecdote? There was a person who worked at Starbucks who was a personal friend of Randy's, and I get a call from her, and she's like, hey, we're wondering if we can get a Clover for a demo for Howard. We'll have a special part of the room, and you will come in to do the demo, but you're going to have to wear a green apron. You're not going to talk. We're going to do the talking. And I was like, okay, So we get in there, and Howard didn't get that memo. He's like, hi, how are you? And do you work for Starbucks? Well, no, actually, I work for the company that made this machine. I made the coffee, and he thought it was awesome. And they bought 2 or 3 of them, and then 2 weeks later, it was in a store or something like that.
I mean, to me, that is probably more like the first time he saw it.
This inconsistency in Howard's Clover story is actually addressed in one of his books. Having had a great cup of coffee at Grumpy, he gets on the phone to his coffee department to ask what the deal with the machine is. He does note, I did not recall that I had actually seen a Clover brewer in action, tasted its coffee, and met its inventor in mid-2007 as part of a demonstration at Starbucks. So now you're wondering, what's all of this got to do with the V60? It's a good question. In March 2008, the specialty industry now knows that brewing by the cup is a very good thing. It lets you offer a variety of flavors to your customer, a variety of price points too. We want to keep doing that, but we don't want to invest either financially or emotionally in another technical sort of solution to it that a company like Starbucks could just buy away from us.
My memory of the time when Starbucks bought the machine was that things weren't going great as it was. They were breaking an awful lot, and I can remember the internal tech team, led by Jim Carr at the time, was often fixing Clovers and getting quite good at it. And so the prospect of not getting access to parts and being able to fix them, these expensive machines, to deliver the most popular drink in the shops was a problem.
We stopped using Clovers in 2010 because what happened was we found out, and then as it started to go along, it was harder to get parts. They started to get expensive, and then they started to not be available. And then, there's all these emails back and forth, frustrated emails about parts that weren't coming in, and we're gonna have to take parts from one Clover to try to fix the other thing. So yeah, it just got frustrating because it was stopping us from actually running our store how we had run it before.
You're probably wondering, how did the coffee actually taste from a Clover?
I can remember Clover coffees. I can remember this sort of hollow but thick profile of them. I remember how much coffee was used to make them. And that seeming kind of ridiculous.
I think that the coffee at best was sort of an 8 out of 10. It was very clean, but arguably it was always under extracted. So you had to increase the dose of the coffee.
I mean, I'm sure we wasted so much coffee. I was trying to find the old recipes, and I think it was just like a lot of coffee. We were putting a lot of coffee in there.
It was quite surprising to go to Starbucks and watch the clover, and when the thing rise, the coffee bed was like almost 2 inches.
The decision to get rid of the clovers happened all at once and seemed to be happening for everyone at the same time. And going back to urn didn't feel like an option when you couldn't provide the same menu option. And so there was a quick search for what's possible.
It's worth remembering that back then, the internet hadn't flattened global coffee culture. Some coffee brewers were only available in certain parts of the world.
But when we first started, it was mocha pots and French presses, and they felt culturally close to us. And then to me, Chemex was the next thing.
The Chemex was a design classic of the pour-over world, but it did create a few issues for cafe owners and baristas.
Well, because it breaks if you use it in the store. Also, you can't put the cup under it. You need something you could put the cup under that just goes into the cup and you can hand it off. We tried the trifecta a few times in Greenpoint. Sorry, I'm smiling, but I remember there was this part of it that would fly out every time you would open. Have you used it before? So that plastic part, we'd open it, it would like shoot across this room, like at a customer. So that didn't work out.
And you're right. Then it was kind of stuff from Asia, stuff from Japan.
A great example of this actually was from January 2008. Blue Bottle Coffee had opened a new location, and at the heart of it, they claimed to have spent $20,000 on a siphon bar. The siphon bar was beautiful, and it certainly drew a crowd, but it wasn't a viable option for most cafes. Then people found the Haerter V60.
After acquisition by Starbucks, everybody were looking for something alternatives. And they found V60.
The V60 was one of many things that were being tried, but it was the quickest and the cheapest sort of point of entry, and one with the most cafe-friendly workflow.
And one of the cafes that really pushed the V60 was Intelligentsia's Monadnock store in Chicago.
The Monadnock store was a beautiful shop in what was, I think, the tallest masonry-built skyscraper in the world. It was the tallest building in the world for a moment.
They'd been brewing a lot of coffee by the cup with the clover and had switched to an all V60 bar and were brewing a huge number of cups every day.
Over a very short period of time, all the clovers were ripped out and pour-over bars were put in. I'll take very little credit for being behind the bars and dealing with the changes. Michael Phillips, Charles Zabinski, Marty Sweeney, many more. They were the ones who had to figure a lot of it out. And there's a lot of talk about wetting filters, a lot of talk about keeping the thermal stability good within the ceramic. It's all fairly anecdotal. But they tasted good, and it was working, and you were able to still do a menu.
Now, if you're not familiar with Haerter, they're a Japanese company specializing in glassware and things like teapots.
Yeah, before launching the V60, we had some coffee items, but not so many people are interested in coffee items.
In 2005, they launched this, the conical-shaped coffee brewer called the V60 because the angle is 60 degrees. It works in Japan, but outside of Japan upon launch, it doesn't really gain much traction. It isn't until specialty coffee starts to grow and take it with it that it really starts to explode.
Hey guys, this is Will Kessler. I'm here at the Hario booth. I've got the whole next year's worth of products here in front of me.
Everybody asking me, I need V60, I need V60. so yeah, everybody wants V60, yeah.
Something about the V60 just fit perfectly. But just how popular is the V60? Haerter have sold over 20 million units of the brewer since 2005, and if you stacked them one on top of the other, the pile would be at least 1,500 kilometers tall. It is unquestionably one of the most popular brewers in the world and is an icon of specialty coffee. That isn't to say that there weren't challenges with the V60 for many cafes.
And I can remember we spent a lot of time building workflows, trying to decide would we make them to order or just always be brewing. And in the end, we decided in those high volume shops, we would always be brewing.
Just to be clear, whether someone had ordered a drink or not, someone was just making a pour over the whole time. And how long would that sit before it had to be dumped? Or
There was a timer. There was a lot of timers and a lot of coffee was dumped. So the spoilage went up quickly.
We didn't go the way of the V60 bar because it takes too long. Just the mechanics of a human pouring water on top of coffee is immensely variable.
We did do pour-overs with the cone, and then we had that in conjunction with the Fedco, and then actually we stopped pour-overs after the pandemic, and we haven't brought it back.
For a long time, if you were a home enthusiast, you could never aspire to have the quality of equipment that a coffee shop would have. They had really expensive espresso machines, fancy grinders, fancy brewers. You didn't have that at home. But suddenly, coffee shops were brewing with like a $6 pour-over cone, and you had $6, and you could buy a pour-over cone too, and you could be brewing just like them and enjoying the same quality of coffee at home. For that reason, it took off in cafes, but it really exploded going into people's homes. But what happened to the Clover once Starbucks had it? Well, the aim was to get it into stores both in the US and internationally, and that was an ambitious plan. And things did not go quite as expected.
I think just because the rollout was completely inept doesn't mean that they didn't attempt to roll it out. Like, yeah. I honestly think they tried.
Oh, they definitely did. I mean, there are a lot of people who worked on the rollout at a time when the company was under enormous pressure. There were all these internal conflicts about rolling out the Clover, and one of them was a huge swath of the stores were having a hard time keeping the bathroom clean and making coffee at all and servicing customers at all.
It was probably about 50 machines for a year or two, and it shot up to around maybe a little over 1,500 machines on a store footprint of 22,000 at that time. My guess is at this point there's a few dozen left, but they're slated for decommissioning.
What I love about telling this story is not just the unintended consequences, which I think are fantastic, but actually this brewer was wildly influential. This really did change the way that people brewed and served and drank filter coffee in coffee shops.
You could argue Clover was responsible for the fascination and adoption with manual brew methods. Batch brew was sort of intangible and just was the norm. Then you do something crazy exotic and different and techie, just to kind of shift you out of it and then go to something really simple and accessible and varied. It's a nice narrative.
I don't think there would have been the reinvigorated interest in brewed coffee if it weren't for Clover.
And yet, no one's really heard of it. And so I feel like this story really deserved to be told. On that front, I want to say a special thank you to my Patreon supporters who support the channel and allow us to make projects like this. And then to you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.